So now I have the pleasure of introducing Adriana Alejandre, who is a licensed trauma therapist and speaker from Los Angeles, California. She owns her own bilingual multicultural practice and EMDR and trauma therapy. She specializes in adults who struggle with anxiety, PTSD, and traumas like mass shootings, homicide attempts, violent assaults, and other crimes. She has done disaster relief work for Hurricane Harvey, Woolsey fire, and the Las Vegas shooting, providing psychological first aid to survivors in shelters. Adriana's work and expertise has been featured in USA Today, BuzzFeed, New York Times, and the LA Times, among others. She is the founder of the internationally recognized Latinx Therapy, the first directory and bilingual podcast that destigmatizes mental health myths and provides education to combat the stigma through technology and in-person services. The inspiration to create Latinx Therapy in 2018 derived from her experience as a single teen mom with postpartum depression and her later frustration in finding relatable, relevant resources for her Latinx clients as a therapist. Her podcast has been featured in iTunes Top 200, Spotify's Top 30 Latin shows, Apple Podcasts Hip Latina, and has been heard in over 112 countries. In 2019, she won Hispanicizes Tecla Award for Best Social Good Content Award. And in 2020, she won the hashtag Yo Soy Instagram and Hispanic Heritage Foundation Award as one of 5 Latinx Influencers of the Year, creating social change. Adriana was born and raised in the lower socioeconomic area of the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. She was raised by a strict Guatemalan mother and a Mexican father, who both had many side hustles since they immigrated from their countries. Adriana looked up to them and grew up knowing that she too wanted to be an entrepreneur. Adriana's mission in the spaces she has established is to create spaces in the real world and virtual world to speak dialogue about mental health, struggles, and strengths in the Latinx community. Adriana currently lives in the San Fernando Valley with her husband, 12-year-old son, and 14-year-old stepson, and their 2 dogs. Now, let me introduce to you Adriana Alejandre.
Gracias, Adali, and thank you, everybody. That was such a mouthful, huh?
I wanted everyone to know everything you've done.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. I appreciate your presence and being here today. So today we're going to be talking about trauma and sexual assault recovery, and I'm going to provide techniques throughout the presentation as well that will help you not only during this presentation, but also afterwards. I believe you're all probably entering finals. So this is a naturally very activating time. So let's go ahead and get started. Adalika gave us a wonderful trigger warning. Some of this content could be activating for survivors, and content will include categories of various types of sexual violence. And I won't be going through them in depth necessarily, but they will be up on the screen. So I just wanted to bring that up now. Survivors are individuals who experience violence directly and also individuals who have witnessed it. We will engage in an exercise in case you are triggered, as I mentioned, but you're also welcome to do what you need to do to feel safe during my presentation. So that could mean, even if that's going on your phone, if you need to distract yourself, whatever it looks like, it's okay with me. So, the goal of this talk is to ignite cultural change and increase awareness overall about trauma and sexual violence. So we're going to talk about a various spectrum of behaviors under the umbrella term of sexual violence. So let's go into our relaxation technique, and this is diaphragmatic breathing. I find it to be very crucial for us at all times, and it's free, it's within us. Raise your hand if you have, I'm going to go with a dog. If you have a dog. Okay, about half of you. Do the other half of you have cats or any other pets? Yeah, okay. All right, I'm gonna stick to dogs though. So if you look at a dog or your dog, when they're napping, you might notice that their bellies inflate pretty wide. Also babies, when babies are breathing, like infant babies, their bellies tend to also inflate pretty like big belly. And that's because they don't have as much stress as us adults do. So what happens over time as we grow up and experience a lot of stressors is it impacts the way that we breathe, and our experiences end up living somatically in our bodies. So we end up breathing less and less and less, so more shallow, okay? And that actually can increase more anxiety and even anxiety attacks. So this breathing style is very important for your own somatic body awareness so that you can reverse it if you're doing more chest breaths. So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna locate our diaphragm, and our diaphragm is like, I'm not an autonomy expert, I specialize in psychology and mental health, right? But I think it's somewhere, when I looked at the pictures, it was at the bottom of your rib cage. So if you can locate, if you feel safe to do so, locate the bottom of your rib cage. It's kind of like a parachute. So it starts at the midsection of the rib cage and falls to the end of the rib cage. So in the center of that area is where we're gonna try to pull the breath from. So when we inhale, and I'm gonna place my hand there because my brain tends to breathe better when my hand is connected to the area where I want the breath to go to. So we're gonna inhale for about 4 seconds through the nose. Through the nose. The belly should expand out. If it doesn't, that's okay. Just inhale through the nose for 4 seconds. Hold for 3 or 4 seconds in the throat. And exhale out from the mouth for 4 or longer seconds. And repeat. The goal here is also to challenge yourself to try to exhale longer and longer and longer. This is a skill and a practice. It took me over 5 years really to get to know my body and how many seconds in I need and how many seconds of holding I need and out that I need. So I encourage you to play with this technique and see what feels best for you. And ideally we want to repeat this 3 times. If you have difficulty sleeping, especially when you feel anxious or nervous or during, just in general if you have trouble sleeping, the more times that you do this and the deeper that you do it, the better, because it can activate that rest and digest mode, which will slip you right into sleeping, because this is connected to our nervous system. Okay, I also want to give a land acknowledgement. Our offices are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tonga land. So physically, although I do national work, my offices are in what's now known as Irvine. I want to definitely recognize the Tonga people. And so if you want to find out what land you are on, I do recommend going on native-land.ca to find out. I think this is such a powerful tool to learn about the people, whose land we're on. Okay, and I'm not going to go through this because Adriana did such a wonderful job. But here are a few facts about me. Yes, I specialize in trauma, dissociation, anxiety among adults on a one-on-one setting, although I also create curriculums and run support groups, global support groups through Latinx therapy. So they are typically sliding scale, low cost, and affordable. And I collaborate with various different providers from across the nation to be able to offer these as well. Okay, so let's talk about what a trauma is. Trauma is a response to an event that activated or continues to activate presently your nervous system's survival responses and continues to impact your overall reaction to similar events. So when let's say, I'm going to take a car accident, for example. A similar event can be driving because your brain now associates car, right, being in a car to the accident. Anything that happened during that event or around that event, now your brain has the potential to connect it and associate it. So that can develop a trauma. But a trauma is also subjective. So maybe just because, let's say, if my partner and I, my husband and I were in the car during the same car accident, it could be traumatic for me, but for him, it might not have been traumatic. For him, it was like, it's just a fender bender, like it's okay, we're gonna be fine. So 2 people can experience one event very differently. One comprehensive study found that 85% of surveyed college students had experienced one traumatic event in their lives, and 1 in 5 students experienced a traumatic event over a 2-month period in college. And unfortunately, this is a consistent stat across various different studies. And my little sources at the bottom. I wanted to also bring up, along with sexual violence and trauma, generational trauma. And this is a transmission or sending down to younger generations harmful behaviors or dysfunctional coping mechanisms due to oppressive and traumatic events. So here we have a little image, the eldest member saying stupid, then the next generation reframes it as you're not good enough, and then that zigzag is trying to break the cycle where the next parent realizes, hey, there's a pattern here and I'm going to reframe this instead to I love you. I want to explain this a little further with a different example. It could be a great grandmother coping by cutting off emotions so that interactions may not be affectionate. They may be cold or tumultuous. When we hear the term now, we have difficult mothers, we have difficult grandmothers. And it could be a result of generational trauma. This isn't a diagnosis by any means. So with this specific example, it could then become a learned behavior by others. So other people can witness and experience the coldness from the great-grandmother and adopt that as a coping mechanism or strategy for themselves. And the effects of this are that future generation learns defensive behaviors. There's norms around expressions of emotions. There's denial, refusing to admit that any trauma has happened. That happens a lot with a lot of clients that I see, especially when they bring in their family members. No, that's their experience, that's not my experience. The chancla didn't affect me, it made me better. Minimizing the impact of trauma or abuse on the self or others. So it's very hard for folks with deep generational trauma wounds to validate and empathize for others sometimes. A lot of people also with generational trauma tend to connect through crisis and chaos, sometimes because that's all that they know. And sometimes people believe that kind of volume of problems is love. Control also tends to be viewed as a sign of love. I included this stat here that the main prevalence of sexual re-victimization across studies consistently also was around 47.9%. There was one that was above 80%. And what this means, I also did research on this when I was at Pepperdine with Dr. Tama Bryant Davis in her, it was 2015, Culture and Trauma Lab, actually. And what we found then and now is that if you experience sexual abuse at one point in your life, the statistic the statistic of being re-victimized jumps by double. So you are 50% average more likely to experience some sort of sexual assault or trauma, and that is a very insane statistic. And there's a lot of studies that study and try to help survivors with this to reduce victimization. And I think specifically, for example, in my culture, right, I identify as Latina, Mexican, Guatemalan. This happens a lot because there's stigma, right, associated with certain topics like sexual assault. And there's a lot of also embarrassment, right, with naming body parts, vagina, penis, right? When I see clients that have experienced childhood sexual abuse, a lot of them, there's one story I can recall very generally that this child was taught for such a long time that their private part was called some name, let's say shrimp, okay? It was called shrimp, or flower. Those are two common ones. And when they're talking about the incident with other members tend to not connect that this is about sexual assault because of these names, these labels. And so it's very important that we end that cycle and give it the name, the body parts that they are. And the sooner that we do that in our development, the easier that it is to desensitize us from that embarrassment. All right, so, okay. These are some of the common symptoms of trauma here. And in my work as a therapist and also trauma survivor myself, I hear and know that sometimes we go through seasons in our life where we change our lives to accommodate the triggers and the flashbacks that we presently are experiencing just because they're scary and uncomfortable. So it'll make more sense as I show you the content here. So triggers can look like this: anniversary dates, sensory experiences. So by sensory, referring to touch. That's why it's definitely not recommended to hug or even put your hand on a survivor's hand when they're disclosing, because touch is very triggering. Triggers can also look like people, places, smells associated with the trauma. Current stressors, so for a lot of college students, current stressors can look like your academics, right? Or even family problems back home. That can naturally be a trigger, kind of like it opens the door for any traumas that you have been suppressing in the past to come on into the present state. And then as I'm talking about history of different traumas as well, if you experience a sexual assault in the present or any type of sexual violence, any history in your past, it'll just feel like double the wound. And these can naturally also lead to something called flashbacks. Raise your hand if you're familiar with flashbacks. If you've heard about them, okay. So flashbacks happen unexpectedly in the form of images, sounds, and sensations. A lot of literature talks about flashbacks in the form of memories or images. But our bodies, again, if you've heard of the book, The Body Keeps Score, that one's a very good, lengthy book, very intellectual book. It's hard to get through because there's a lot of information, but it's very, very informative about this. And our bodies, like I mentioned in the beginning, hold all of our experiences, whether it's trauma or not, but it holds all of our experiences. And if we're not processing them in some way, they're going to manifest and develop in different ways. And so, yes, when we experience something scary or traumatic, your body will kind of mold onto that. It can also look like reliving the trauma. A lot of my clients, and myself included, I talk about this also on my social media channels sometimes when I experience this, how it just feels like we stay frozen in this state of mind when we're experiencing a flashback sometime. You can be anywhere and experience this. You can also be mid-conversation and then people, will ask you like, oh, what do you think of that? Sometimes you can snap into it like, oh yeah, that sounds great. And sometimes you'll just say, oh yeah, that sounded all fine. And you cannot even remember it, even though you were nodding and assumingly present. Flashbacks can lead to very high emotional, intense reactions, and sometimes you may not even understand yourself, like why am I reacting this way, or why did I say that, why did I respond like that? Again, because maybe somatically in your body you're experiencing something. And it could lead to dissociation or stress responses. We're going to talk about stress responses right now. These are the 4 Fs, and I find them to be very interesting. On social media, they're being taught as trauma responses, but these are stress responses. And so the difference is that they can occur even if there's not a trauma happening. So if you get anxious, or again, finals, or something happening at home, non-traumatic, any of these can come up. So you might go into fight mode. And this can be like, maybe if your parents said something like, oh, you look, this and this way, something about your body image. You might verbally stand your ground and say, don't talk to me like that. And that can be a form of also fight. It isn't just physical, it could be verbal. So it could be expressive, advocating, but it can also be physical aggression and even touch for some people. There's also flight, where people physically run away or avoid the situation. Something is activating in the moment. Something's very stressful for people that I see, individuals, college students. It's breakups. I'd rather just go the other way. I don't even want to deal with this. I don't even want to talk to the person or tell them that we have broken up. Running away is a stress response. Freeze. So this can be numbing or being in a frozen state during the stressor, and it's necessary to survive the situation. Sometimes, historically in our graduate programs, they taught us that it's very important to get the person out of this freeze mode. But we find that to be more damaging because it's a person's protective response. We are in these stress responses for a reason. Our bodies tend to know what they're doing with us in that moment to keep us feeling safe. And so it isn't helpful to immediately get someone out of their natural stress response. Awareness about what's happening within your body and in your mind is important before coming out of it. Then there's a newer one called fawn. And this one is using people pleasing to diffuse or calm the situation to help you kind of rebalance, recalibrate a sense of safety. And this one it can look like maybe if there's a crime happening, like a burglary, you're at the ATM and someone says, give me your wallet or give me that money. You'll say, yes, anything that you want, yes, absolutely, right? You're agreeing to that situation, not because you want to, or because you're in compliance, right? But because you want to keep yourself safe, okay? And there are very physical, mental, and emotional responses within these. This is just an overview and intro. These can be automatic and also can be learned behavior. So just like generational trauma, right? If you witnessed a parent going into the fight response often, you're more likely going to adopt the fight response or the opposite. It could be the freeze response. It does vary, but these can be learned behaviors as well based off of your upbringing and environment. So what defines sexual violence? And this is the engagement of unwanted sexual acts by force or threat and without consent, right? We're emphasizing without consent. We're also going to learn about what consent means. I want to remind those of you here, if it feels right for you to take a deep breath, please do so. Sexual violence is not just assault, it is any sexual activity without consent, and they can fall into any categories of touch or non-touch. But regardless, it is still all considered sexual violence. And society tends to make us think that there's a hierarchy of what is more serious, and our laws unfortunately reflect that belief, right? So, and I'll talk a lot about that, but it's important to recognize trauma as more individualized. So what that means is, for example, within my field, domestic violence, right, is not something that is reportable, unfortunately, unless a child gets hurt, and that's only because children are a protected population. And so, same with sexual violence, there are certain things in the laws that they will accept, like catcalls. That's not something that they would, is reportable, unfortunately. So that's what I meant by this. And again, I'm not going to go through exactly what this is going to bring up. It's going to bring up various different types of sexual violence. But sexual violence is a broad category. Think of it like an umbrella term of actions of which a person exerts their power and control, keyword, power and control over another person through unwanted or harmful sexual actions or words. And so these are different forms of sexual violence. And jokes about assault, sometimes we may not even think that that can be considered sexual violence, but that is sexual violence. That puts people in a stress response that activates a lot of survivors as well. Ultimately, if you think about it, it doesn't make you feel safe, right, within your own body and externally. So the statistics on this slide come from various different sources, like the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the U.S. Department of Justice. And as much as I did not want to include them because they are alarming and they, are a little scary to me, knowing is better than avoiding ultimately. According to the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, the first 6 weeks are the most vulnerable to college students because although some students come to college with already having some experience with alcohol, there are certain aspects of college life, such as the unstructured time, right? Not having anyone kind of supervising you, especially from strict households, the widespread availability of alcohol, inconsistent enforcement of underage drinking, limited interactions with parents or other adults, adult roles. These can all intensify the student's vulnerability to social pressures. So that is why the first 6 weeks are a lot more vulnerable to incoming college students. Okay, this one is an intense sentence as well. This is a fact versus myth. And it is, I was aroused during, I must have wanted it. Something we also hear from survivors, something that a lot of survivors don't want to share because it brings about a lot of shame. But again, something crucial we gotta talk about. And so with this one, the fact is that orgasms or other sexual, physiologically bodily responses don't mean that someone wanted or enjoyed the sex, and it was not sex. Orgasm can be a natural biological bodily reaction that someone cannot control. It's not something that we can control. It does not mean that forced or coerced sexual activity was consensual just because an orgasm happened, okay? And so I think that's why a lot of survivors word it in this way. I'm gonna go back, I know it's bright. I was aroused during, I must have wanted it. Because it's very confusing physiologically when you witness your body experience that. But education about our bodies is crucial for us to know, especially what we can and cannot control, right? And then often, a lot of perpetrators use this fact to silence and confuse the survivor. So let's talk about consent. Consent is permission or voluntary agreement between two sober individuals to engage in the sexual activity. It can be given in different ways, but must be given before the sexual encounter. And check-ins during sexual activity are also crucial because consent can change at any time and can be withdrawn at any time. The sexual activity should stop right then and there. Silence doesn't count as consent. And legally, someone under the influence is incapable of giving consent since substances impair a person's judgment to consent. So that's here in California, but that can change, unfortunately, from state to state. And I have a video. Adeli, will this be given to the folks here?
Yeah, okay. If you say yes, then yes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of resources that I provide at the end of this presentation, but you can also YouTube consent, TEA consent, and there's like a 2.5-minute video that explains like with a little stick figure about consent. Okay, so we're gonna learn another activity collectively, and this one's called the butterfly hug, and it comes from EMDR. I'm an approved consultant with this, and EMDR is an acronym, but it stands for eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. We don't need to know all that, but essentially it's left and right movement that helps the brain to process experiences. It can be used slowly or fast. Fast is what is used in therapy. Slow is what I'm going to teach you because you can use it at any time to help, again, the nervous system. So I think I have the instructions. No, I don't. Okay. What it is you're just going to cross your arms. And I am going to ask, if you feel safe, you don't have to place your hands on somewhere on your body that feels safe for you. So for me, I have the most sensation and feel safe right out here. Okay, some of my clients prefer here, some of them up here, so wherever feels right for you. For some reason, I don't have sensation too much up here. My husband says that my nerves are dead up there because he'll like go like this, and I'm like, I don't feel it, go harder. So yeah, here is fine for me. And what we're gonna do, I want to invite you to get into a relaxed position. You can lower your eye gaze or close your eyes, but after the instructions. And what you'll do is you'll just tap one hand at a time slowly. Tap, 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 tap. Make sure you feel, right, the sensation of your hand and the temperature of your hand. Okay, take a breath. this next breath, go ahead and deflate a little bit extra, lower your shoulders. Okay, so this is the technique butterfly hug. So you can go ahead and rub if that feels right for you, or you can pause or continue at any time. And if during the deep breathing or the butterfly hug you find yourself yawning, that means you activated the nervous system. We have a few, but two primarily. The parasympathetic one that says it's okay to rest and digest. Hold on, I don't mean stop. Yes, rest and digest. So what do survivors experience after trauma? So let me go ahead and bring all these up. There's shame, guilt, PTSD, anxiety, grief, depression, suicide, thoughts, self-harm, and there's increased use in substances. Why? Because they're trying to cope. Somatically, so in the body, right, we're focusing a lot of body awareness here. There's pressure on the chest, headaches, sleep and appetite issues, unexplainable aches, maybe the shoulders or lower back or the toe, heart palpitations, sometimes the heart can just race randomly, jaw pain, teeth grinding, sweating without movement. You might not even be doing anything and all of a sudden you're just sweating. Stomach cramps or a lot of digestion issues. So in general, a lot of trauma survivors of any sort experience a lot of tummy issues. And there's also some studies about that, but in our culture specifically, our culture tends to not express emotions and hold things inside the body. So what happens when we do that? If we think of a soda bottle, right? Let's say this is a little soda. Metaphorically, this is us, and every shake is a problem. So one problem, we don't talk about it. Another problem, another problem, another problem. What's gonna happen? This is gonna explode. It's just not gonna feel good. And before it explodes, it has so much gas inside, right? So much happens within us. So this is why mental health and somatic awareness is very important. Barriers towards reporting include, the survivors not wanting others to know in general. There's lack of proof maybe, fear of retaliation, or not even being believed. Being unsure of whether what happened is even assault, violence, not knowing how to report. I think that's a huge one. Fear of being treated poorly by the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, this is valid in many cases. I'm sorry. And then there's also the fear of, within the fear of judgment, the el que dirán in Spanish, right? What will they say? What will people say about this? Being blamed keeps survivors from disclosing. And some students are at higher risk of victimization on campus or experience negative repercussions when they do report. So these themes impact the likelihood of disclosure even more for marginalized students, especially for LGBTQIA identifying students and also Black and Brown people. So how do I know if this is something I'm experiencing? You might be questioning if what happened was an assault or not. So if you're questioning it already, most likely something wrong happened. You're experiencing poor work or school performance. And so this can also be towards trauma, right? Or any mental health condition. There's conflict with peers, friends, or family. All of a sudden, health concerns, especially if they're unexplained. Poor self-care, you're not taking care of yourself like you did before. You find yourself maybe prioritizing others. This can potentially be under codependency. And I can explain that a little bit further. Codependency is when we rely on someone else to fill an emotional void within us. And a lot of times people tend to seek others for approval, validation, and that is connected to lack of self-worth and self-esteem. So how can institutions support us? And this is, I know we don't have the head of institutions here, but hopefully we can advocate. We need to increase awareness of risk, signs, and resources. We need to advocate for Title IX and the consequences to perpetrators and be consistent about that. Encourage more advocates, students, and staff to stand as supports. So how can students, especially survivors, if they choose to, be a support? Is there a space for that on campus? And teaching trauma-informed approaches to receiving disclosures among orientation to staff and students, I think, can be very powerful. And there's there was a stat, but I couldn't find it again, but the first response to a survivor is the most important. So I think it was something like that the first person that a survivor discloses to will indicate how they're going to cope throughout the recovery of their sexual assault. So yeah, I found that to also be very true, and I think that's something that has to be known. So a little bit more about the systemic barriers for sexual violence. There's lack of resources, and I know we all know this. So when it comes to mental health, I want to talk about victims of crime. Raise your hand if you know about victims of crime. Yeah, okay. So I learned that this differs state by state, but unfortunately within California, it is required for, if you want to use the Victims of Crime program, to have a police report. So if you do have a police report, then they will cover up to 40 counseling sessions with a provider that accepts this program, or they can offer medical support. So if you had to go to the doctors and paid out of pocket for it, they can reimburse that. If something happened to your phone or to your home during the crime, right, they can cover that. But unfortunately, to qualify for this program in California, a police report is required. Now, there are other programs, and I do include them towards the end of what survivors can do or have. But if the survivor chooses, to disclose and have a police report, victims of crime can be very useful. All right. And then there's gender bias. When we address sexual violence, we think of young women typically, and oftentimes forget about the young men and who experience this, and also the gender non-conforming individuals. There's cultural notions, machismo, that's rooted in patriarchy, right? And marianismo. Raise your hand if you know about marianismo. Okay. I think in teaching about this for a while now, I've learned that different cultures have this, but under a different label that I'm unfamiliar with. But within my culture, marianismo is the role of women, how women are supposed to behave, are supposed to act in general. And so here, I'm gonna read this. So marianismo is a popular term that implies an idealized view of femininity based on the image of Mary, the Virgin Mother. And it connotes, basically, it encompasses passivity, submissiveness, and to be like a virgin, a model for other women. And if we think back to maybe our grandparents, right, especially if they are immigrants from other countries, this is something that was deeply rooted in many of our households, that we should dress a certain way, we should talk a certain way or not talk a certain way, shouldn't drink, right, or hide a lot of things about us. And this ultimately impacts a lot of survivors because we're supposed to respect patriarchal values. We're supposed to be submissive and be quiet about it. And if we dress a certain way also, maybe we wanted it, right? So this is all under marianismo, unfortunately. Machismo is also something that is connected to marianismo, and this one is the role of men. Men are supposed to reserve their emotions. Men are not supposed to express sadness or fear. Aggression is welcomed, but every other emotion is not. And we're supposed to be passive towards violence or their womanizing tendencies, right? And so machismo culturally also has allowed for a lot of, it's kind of been permissive, right? Has allowed a lot of the violence that has gone on within our culture. Right now in Mexico, right, we know of there's feminicide going on, right? And I believe not just there, but I think in Guatemala también and in other Central American countries, unfortunately, there's a lot of missing women. And sexual violence ties hand in hand with this topic. All right, let's get into cultural stigmatizing statements that impact help seeking, so whether we ask for help. Snap your fingers if you've heard crying is for the weak. Okay. Snap your fingers if you've heard something like all you need to do is pray and talk to God. It's all in your head. If you feel cured, if you feel better, you're all cured. Con un traguito se te quita todo. If you drink, it's all gonna go away. You shouldn't complain, at least you still have an opportunity to graduate. At least you still have school, right? This goes anything with mental health. We don't seek mental health oftentimes therapy because of many of these statements. We're conditioned to believe that our feelings are a burden for other people. We're conditioned to believe that we should be okay regardless of what is happening because we are in a much more privileged position than maybe our parents have been. And ultimately, it follows us. I remember the first time I went to therapy, it was because I didn't know I was experiencing postpartum depression, but I went to office hours. And it was for an abnormal psychology class, and the professor looked me like in the eye. You know how people usually casually ask like, "Oh, how are you?" And you're like, "Oh, fine." This wasn't like that. Like this was like a, "How are you?" And I felt it in my soul. And so I was just kind of rattled, and I opened up a little bit. And that's where I learned that my tuition was covering counseling services. And after he heard my story a little bit, which was that I had just become a single teen mom, and my mom, didn't want the baby, so she was forcing me to try to do a lot of illegal things. And it was a very scary time for me, to be alone in college, and my support in Los Angeles, freshly broken up with, right? It's hard at that age. And so I remember coming out thinking like, I just never thought therapy was for someone like me. Like I knew it existed, but I never thought to connect myself with it. So I gave it a try, but unfortunately I didn't go past 3 sessions. And that's because I kept hearing my mom's voice or her message of, we fix problems inside the family. Because when I got pregnant, I got in trouble for reaching out to my best friend's mom and for her helping me to talk about this with my family. And my mom was not happy that I had reached out to someone else about it, that I had the audacity to tell someone else that I was pregnant. I'm scared of the woman even to this day. So, sorry mom, but trust is earned, right? Like it starts from when we're very, very young. And so, I think all of these, eventually I was able to overcome that because I remembered how much I enjoyed just feeling validated by someone else in therapy. So that at least those 3 sessions gave me that, and I returned back in graduate school. So what is it that we do with this information? We have to reflect on the stigmas that we grew up with. We have to know what are some of those messages. So like in the last screen where you saw all the ones that you snapped about, we have to know, how did these impact me? How are these currently affecting me? Do not provide unsolicited advice. So this is as a support. So if someone comes to you with a disclosure, right? Or if you're noticing someone struggling with their mental health in general, I'm gonna generalize here. We ask instead, how can I support you? Okay. Sometimes it's just natural, especially if we really love the person, right? Like, okay, we're gonna go get you some help. I'm gonna find therapists for you, and I'm gonna take you to your first appointment. You wanna be really helpful, but sometimes their nervous system might be too overwhelmed for all of that. You need time, right? We wanna validate feelings. I'm here for you. I hear that. I don't understand firsthand, but I'm hearing you, and I'll be here for you, right? I statements. You're not alone even, could be fine. Offer resources for when they're ready. When you're ready, I'm willing to help you find resources on campus or off campus. If you need grocery shopping or whatever you need outside for your home, I'm willing to help you. Respect personal space, and if you show support via touch, ask for consent. So again, some people are huggers, right? But again, that can seem very daunting, especially after a trauma. So one thing that a lot of some clients come to me about is feeling upset when their significant other or their best friends tend to ask for space, because then it activates some sort of victimhood within us, right? Well, now maybe they're upset with me. That can also potentially be a trauma response in the sense of, when we tend to ask, like, are you mad at me? Did I do something? It isn't personal. It is them stating their boundary. Unless you did something wrong, right? It's okay to ask, but if there's repeated asking and high levels of anxiety within you, then that's something maybe that is important for you to work on. Do not ask questions so it makes sense to you. With the Las Vegas mass shooting survivors, some of their loved ones were like, well, why didn't you go here? Why did you even go, or where were you? I know that when trauma happens, people need to make sense of the events, but when there's a disclosure, that's just not the time. So it's really important to say that you believe them. As a support, we need to practice mind-body interventions to prevent our own nervous systems from getting activated, right? So that can look like the butterfly hug that we practice, or the deep breathing. It can look like stretching, yoga, walking. We want to engage in resistance and activism, but within your own limitations. So if there's anything on campus that you can do some activism work on, right, per your own capacity, or petitions to sign, that would be helpful for passing laws that'll help sexual violence survivors. That can be something to look into. And we need to mix up our social media feed. So myself as a therapist, I have a lot of mental health stuff, but I don't always want to think about mental health, and that's okay. I want to think about interior design or plants or cute little pets that, just mixing it up sometimes is helpful. And so when we're beginning the healing process, here are some 4 pillars that I find to be themes when we need to just recover from traumas. We need to establish a sense of safety. We don't feel safe, right? The world is unsafe. We remember when I emphasized power and control. Power and control is taken from us when we experience a trauma or traumas. And so we need to learn a choice, that we have the power to make decisions, that we have the power to gain control back from within our bodies. Trust, that we can trust certain people, right, in our circles. We can trust ourselves, our own intuition, because sometimes, for example, again with the mass shooting, let's say survivors, they don't trust their judgment. They're like, I went there, I made that choice to go, right? And so that doesn't mean that it's always going to happen. I think sometimes we tend to get stuck in those narratives because we experience something scary. So processing that out loud, not just in your mind, is super helpful. And ultimately healing, and that can look differently for everyone. So we want to give ourselves permission to seek and ask for help with someone that you trust, because you're not a burden. We want to learn assertive communication skills, and I'm going to be talking about that at 1:30. We want to practice boundary setting with unsupportive people especially, so dysfunctional people and places. We want to lean into resources and community and seek trauma-informed healing, whether that's in one-on-one therapy or support groups. There's a lot of support groups for sexual assault survivors that are free. Okay, and then I won't go through this slide, but here are some helpful things to do to recover without therapy, and then to recover with therapy. These are certain theories and modalities that you can ask, when doing a consultation, like, do you specialize in this? How do you use this with my experience, right? One that I forgot to add is brain spotting. So brain spotting is also another powerful one that uses your eyes. Where your eyes react is essentially where your brain is feeling the experience, and so that's another one. Okay, and then here are some resources. My podcast has some episodes on childhood sexual abuse, and also I believe we have one about sexual assault. They're in English and in Spanish, most episodes, especially the educational ones. Nopal Queens is a general mental health podcast. Therapy for Black Girls is another great educational podcast. And then The Homecoming by Dr. Tama Bryant Davis, who now has a book for survivors called The Homecoming as well. Highly recommend her podcast. NAMI, here are some 2 free support groups. Those are their websites. They are located across the nation. Not just for sexual violence survivors, so this is just in general mental health support. And then low-cost mental health support for like individual one-on-one. LatinxTherapy.club, that's like where we have the support groups. LatinxTherapy.com is where we have the individual therapists. OpenPathCollective.org is a national nonprofit that hosts different therapists that offer sliding scale. For our website, Latinx Therapy, or maybe any other directory, I recommend if you see like a scary number like $250 a session or something like that, ask the therapist if they can accommodate what you can afford. So if you can afford 20, 30, 40, whatever it is, ask them, hey, this is my situation, I can afford this on a weekly basis. Is this something that you can honor? Or do you know of someone that can, that can, take this rate? But I think I also include some questions to ask your insurance. If not, then I have it on my website. Here are some therapy funds. So my foundation is relatively new. We're still fundraising. We only have like 3 stipends we're going to give out sometime this year. But essentially, yes, we're going to be giving out money for people to afford at least 8 therapy sessions at $100 a session. The Loveland Foundation does this as well. This one is for Black women and girls. And then Brown Sister Speaks also provides therapy stipends. Mental Health Liberation is a newer nonprofit as well by my colleague, Melody Lee, who is also providing therapy funds. I think they're still starting up. Dark Beauty is another one that provides folks of color stipends and money for therapy. They've been doing this for a while. And then Asian Mental Health Collective as well has a very large therapy fund. So that's my presentation, and then here are the citations and resources for when it is shared with links. Thank you so much, everybody.